A black man in a tailored suit steps into a busy downtown cafe, his calm demeanor radiating confidence. He orders his coffee, finds a quiet corner, and pulls out his laptop, ready to work. The cafe buzzes with chatter and the clinking of cups until the door swings open with a jarring clang. A white officer strides in, his eyes scanning the room like he is on a mission. His gaze locks onto the man. Without hesitation, the officer approaches. "You do not belong here," he says, his voice loud enough to silence the cafe. Shocked murmurs ripple through the crowd as the man looks up, his expression steady. "I paid for my coffee," he replies, his voice calm but firm. The officer's accusations escalate, calling the man a trespasser and demanding he leave. But the man remains seated, his calm presence a stark contrast to the officer's growing hostility. The tension thickens as other patrons pull out their phones to record the unfolding drama. What happens next changes everything. The man's true identity is revealed, leaving the officer and everyone in the cafe stunned. Stay with us to uncover the jaw-dropping twist in this unforgettable story. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and amaze. Jonathan Carter sat by the window of a busy cafe, his navy blue suit perfectly tailored, a steaming cappuccino in hand. He scrolled through emails on his laptop, exuding calm and composure. But the peaceful afternoon was about to take a turn no one expected. A sharp voice shattered the hum of conversation. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" It was Officer Tom Grant, his badge gleaming under the cafe lights. The officer, known for his aggressive demeanor, stood towering over Jonathan's table, his gaze piercing. Jonathan looked up, unfazed by the interruption. "I am having a coffee," he replied with quiet confidence, his deep voice steady. The officer's expression hardened. "I need you to leave. This isn't a place for people like you." The room froze. Other patrons turned their heads, some whispering, others pulling out their phones to record. Jonathan remained seated, his posture calm but his eyes focused. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me?" he asked, his voice carrying a sharp edge. Grant smirked. "Don't play smart. You do not belong here. Either you leave willingly, or I will make you." Jonathan placed his cup down, his hands steady, and stood. His tall frame commanded attention, but his voice remained measured. "I assure you, officer, I have every right to be here." The tension in the room was electric. What was just an afternoon coffee had become a confrontation everyone could feel. No one yet knew who Jonathan Carter truly was, but what came next would leave them, and Officer Grant, in complete awe. Jonathan Carter's calm demeanor was at odds with the storm brewing in the cafe. Officer Grant stood with his arms crossed, his tone growing more aggressive with each passing second. "I said leave now. I am not going to repeat myself," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. Jonathan adjusted his tie and took a slow breath. He wasn't the type to be intimidated, but he also understood the gravity of the situation. "Officer, I am a paying customer, just like everyone else here," he replied evenly. "I am not breaking any laws." Grant's patience wore thin. He grabbed a chair from the table and yanked it aside, causing a loud screech that made a few patrons gasp. "Do not argue with me," he snapped. "You need to leave now, or I will have you arrested for trespassing." A young woman sitting nearby, her phone discreetly angled toward the scene, whispered to her friend, "Who does he think he is? The man is just drinking coffee." Jonathan remained composed. "Arrest me for what? Sitting in a cafe?" His tone sharpened slightly, but he didn't raise his voice. "I have done nothing wrong, and you know it." Grant leaned closer, his face inches away from Jonathan's. "Do not test me," he hissed. "This isn't up for debate." By now, the room was silent. People were glued to the unfolding drama. An elderly man in the corner shook his head, muttering, "This is disgraceful." A teenage boy at the counter began recording openly, his phone trained on the interaction. Jonathan glanced around, noticing the growing audience. He addressed Grant firmly. "You are making a scene, officer. I suggest you think carefully about your next move." This only enraged Grant further. "You think you're smarter than me, huh? We'll see about that." Without warning, he grabbed Jonathan's arm and pulled him toward the door. The roughness of the action caused a collective gasp from the patrons. "Let go of me," Jonathan said, his voice firm but controlled. He didn't resist, but he also didn't budge from his stance. The officer tightened his grip, clearly intending to drag him outside. At that moment, a middle-aged woman stood up, her voice quivering with indignation. "What are you doing? He hasn't done anything wrong," she exclaimed. Others began to murmur their agreement, but Grant ignored them. His focus remained on Jonathan, whose calmness seemed to fuel his frustration. What Grant didn't realize, however, was that the situation was about to take a turn he would never expect. As Jonathan stood resolute, his true identity remained hidden from the officer, but the truth was closer to being revealed with each passing second, and when it came out, it would leave everyone, including Officer Grant, stunned. The tension in the cafe reached its peak as Officer Grant tightened his grip on Jonathan's arm. Jonathan, refusing to show any fear, met the officer's gaze head-on. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly, his voice firm but not raised. Grant sneered. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can talk your way out of this." He yanked harder, causing Jonathan to stumble slightly. At this point, the crowd was no longer silent. A man near the counter spoke up. "What's your problem, officer? The guy's just sitting here drinking coffee." "Stay out of it," Grant snapped, glaring at the man. "This is official business." Jonathan straightened himself, pulling his arm away from Grant's grasp. "You're out of line," he said, his tone sharp. "You're harassing me without cause, and you're embarrassing yourself in front of all these people." The cafe erupted in murmurs. A woman near the window, who had been quietly filming the entire interaction, called out, "You should be ashamed of yourself. He hasn't done anything wrong." Grant turned toward her, his face red with anger. "Mind your own business," he shouted. "This man is refusing to comply, and I have every right to remove him." Jonathan held his ground. "Comply with what?" he asked. "Sitting in a cafe while black? Is that the crime here?" Grant's face contorted in frustration. "Don't play games with me," he barked. "You're trespassing, and I'm ordering you to leave." Jonathan glanced around at the growing crowd of witnesses. He could see the mix of anger and disbelief on their faces. "If I'm trespassing," he said, "then why haven't you asked anyone else to leave? Or is it just me you have a problem with?" Grant hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by Jonathan's calm logic. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "You're not the one in charge here," he spat. "I am." At that moment, a young boy who had been recording from the counter called out, "He didn't do anything! You're just being a bully!" Grant turned toward the boy, his anger boiling over. "Put that phone away before I confiscate it," he snapped. The boy's mother stepped in, pulling her son closer. "You won't touch him," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "We've all seen what you're doing. You're going to regret this." Grant's attention shifted back to Jonathan, who still hadn't moved. "Enough of this," the officer growled. "You're coming with me." He reached for his cuffs, but before he could act, Jonathan raised his voice for the first time. "Do you even know who I am?" Jonathan asked. His tone filled with authority. The room fell silent again, all eyes on him. Grant hesitated, his hand hovering over his cuffs. "I don't care who you are," he said, though his voice faltered slightly. Jonathan took a step forward, closing the gap between them. "You should care," he said, "because the moment you put those cuffs on me, your career is over." The officer blinked, momentarily thrown off by the man's confidence. The crowd waited in hushed anticipation, sensing that something big was about to happen. Jonathan pulled out his wallet and opened it slowly. He held up a badge, the gold catching the light. "I'm Jonathan Carter," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Attorney General of this state." The room erupted in gasps. Grant's face went pale and his mouth opened and closed as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "I have dedicated my career to fighting injustice," Jonathan continued, "and I won't tolerate it. Not for myself, not for anyone else." The crowd began murmuring again, this time with a mixture of awe and outrage. "He's the Attorney General?" someone whispered. "Unbelievable." Grant took a step back, his hands shaking. I didn't know," he stammered. "You didn't bother to know," Jonathan shot back. "You saw a black man sitting in a cafe, and you decided that was enough reason to act like this. Well, now you're going to answer for it." The cafe patrons erupted in applause, their voices rising in support of Jonathan. Grant, overwhelmed and humiliated, could do nothing but stand there as the gravity of his mistake sunk in. The cafe was buzzing with energy after Jonathan revealed his identity. The officer stood frozen, his hand still hovering over his cuffs. For a moment, the entire room was silent, Except for the hum of whispered disbelief, Jonathan didn't flinch. He let the weight of his words settle in the room. "I want to be very clear," Jonathan said, his voice sharp and commanding. "You have not just disrespected me. You have disrespected the values of justice and equality that this country is supposed to stand for." The officer stammered, I didn't know, sir." Jonathan held up a hand to stop him. "That's the problem. You didn't take a moment to think. You didn't even ask a question. You acted on prejudice, and now you're scrambling for an excuse." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement. A man near the counter chimed in, "He's right. We all saw what happened. You didn't even try to treat him with respect." The officer's face turned red. His confidence was now completely replaced by panic. "I was just doing my job," he said weakly. Jonathan took a step forward. Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and humiliate. What you've done here is not just an insult to me. It's an insult to every single person in this room." The woman who had been filming the incident stepped forward. "We've got this all recorded," she said. "This will go viral. People need to see what's really happening out here." Jonathan nodded at her, appreciating her bravery. "Thank you," he said. "The truth needs to come out, and people like him need to be held accountable." The officer tried to defend himself. "This is all a misunderstanding," he stuttered. "Misunderstanding?" Jonathan repeated, his tone cold. "You didn't misunderstand anything. You saw a black man sitting in a cafe and you made up your mind before I even said a word. That's not a misunderstanding. That's bias. That's discrimination." The tension in the room was electric. The crowd had gone from passive observers to active participants. They weren't just watching Jonathan stand up for himself. They were standing with him. Suddenly, the cafe door swung open. Another police officer walked in, alerted by the commotion. He glanced around the room and immediately noticed the tension. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cautious. The crowd began to speak all at once, explaining what had happened. The officer looked at Jonathan, who still held his badge in hand. His eyes widened in recognition. "Attorney General Carter," he said, his voice respectful. "That's right," Jonathan said, "and your colleague here has a lot to answer for." The second officer turned to Grant, his face stern. "Is this true?" he asked. "Did you harass this man without cause?" Grant stammered, unable to find the words to defend himself. Jonathan took control of the situation. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said, "not just against him but against the system that allows people like him to operate with impunity." The second officer nodded. "Understood, sir. I'll make sure this is investigated thoroughly." Jonathan turned back to the crowd. "Thank you all for your support," he said. "This is what change looks like, standing together, refusing to be silent in the face of injustice." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices filled with admiration and solidarity. As the second officer escorted Grant out of the cafe, the patrons began to approach Jonathan, shaking his hand and thanking him for standing up. "You're an inspiration," one woman said. "We need more people like you." Jonathan smiled, though his expression remained serious. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all of us. We all have the power to demand better." The cafe, which had been the site of such tension just moments before, was now filled with a sense of unity and hope. People left that day not just with a story to tell, but with a renewed sense of purpose. News of the incident spread rapidly. By the time Jonathan left the cafe, the video recorded by a bystander had already begun making waves online. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times with captions like, "Another day, another injustice," and "When the victim is the Attorney General." Social media platforms exploded with reactions. People from all walks of life expressed outrage over the officer's behavior. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination, while others applauded Jonathan for standing his ground. The hashtags #Justice for All and #Racist Cop Exposed trended within hours. National news outlets picked up the story. The video showed everything: the officer's aggressive approach, Jonathan calmly revealing his identity, and the crowd standing in solidarity. It was undeniable evidence of blatant bias. At the cafe, the manager, who had initially stayed quiet, decided to speak out. She posted an open letter online apologizing to Jonathan and condemning the officer's actions. "Our cafe has always been a place for everyone," she wrote. "What happened today does not reflect our values, and we will be working to ensure incidents like this never happen again. The backlash hit the local police department hard. The department's social media accounts were flooded with comments demanding accountability. "How can we trust you to protect us when you treat innocent people like criminals?" One comment read. Community leaders called for action. Civil rights organizations planned protests outside the police station, demanding reforms. At a press conference, the police chief was forced to address the issue. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Grant," the chief said, his expression somber. "An internal investigation has been launched, and the officer has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." But the public wasn't satisfied. Administrative leave isn't enough. One protester said during a live news interview, "We need systemic change. This isn't about one bad cop. This is about a culture of bias that needs to be dismantled." Meanwhile, Jonathan's phone rang non-stop. Messages of support poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the video. He decided to issue a statement to the media. "What happened to me is something that happens to countless others every day," Jonathan said, standing on the steps of the courthouse. "The only difference is that I had the privilege of my position to protect me. But what about those who don't have that privilege? This isn't just about me. This is about fighting for justice for everyone." His words resonated deeply, sparking even more calls for accountability. People began organizing community meetings to discuss how they could push for change. At one such meeting, a young woman stood up and shared her story. "I was stopped by that same officer last year," she said, her voice trembling. "He accused me of stealing my own car. I was too scared to fight back, but seeing Jonathan stand up gave me hope." Her story wasn't the only one. More people came forward, sharing similar encounters with Officer Grant. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. As the protests grew, the city's mayor was forced to get involved. She announced plans for a task force to address racial bias in law enforcement. "This incident has shown us that we have a lot of work to do," the mayor said. "We need to rebuild trust between our police department and our community." Jonathan was invited to join the task force as a consultant. While he accepted, he made it clear that his focus would remain on systemic change. "This isn't about one committee or one report," he said. "This is about creating a future where no one has to fear being judged or mistreated because of the color of their skin." The café, once a quiet spot in the community, became a symbol of resistance and hope. People began leaving notes of support on its walls, turning it into a makeshift memorial for justice. In the weeks that followed, Officer Grant faced formal charges for misconduct. His trial became a pivotal moment for the city. It wasn't just about holding him accountable. It was about sending a message that discrimination would no longer be tolerated. The incident, though painful, became a turning point. It united the community in a way that hadn't been seen before. People who once felt powerless now felt empowered to speak out and demand change. Jonathan's calm yet powerful response had not only exposed injustice, but had also ignited a movement. It was a reminder that one voice, when amplified by others, could make a difference. As the city continued to grapple with its flaws, it also began to heal. Conversations about bias and equality became more frequent. Schools started incorporating lessons on diversity and inclusion. Businesses began offering training on unconscious bias. The incident that had started with an act of discrimination ended with a renewed commitment to justice and equality. Jonathan's actions proved that change was possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice. The aftermath of the incident left the city divided but also sparked introspection. While Officer Grant faced the consequences of his actions, there was a broader realization that change needed to start with individuals and extend to institutions. Jonathan chose to approach the situation with a combination of accountability and education. He publicly stated, "While holding people accountable is important, true progress lies in addressing the roots of prejudice and fostering understanding." Grant, after being suspended, faced widespread criticism and shame. At first, he was defensive, refusing to acknowledge his bias. But as the stories of others affected by his actions surfaced, he began to reflect. Community leaders reached out, offering him an opportunity to attend workshops on racial sensitivity and implicit bias. Initially hesitant, Grant accepted. In one workshop, He listened to personal accounts from people of color who had experienced discrimination. A young man's story about being wrongfully arrested struck a nerve. "I could have destroyed someone's life because I didn't take a moment to think," Grant later admitted. The workshops became a turning point for him. He began volunteering with local community groups, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. "I can never undo the harm I've caused, but I can work to ensure it doesn't happen again," Grant said during a community event. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued his advocacy. He collaborated with civil rights organizations to launch an initiative focused on training law enforcement officers in empathy and cultural awareness. The program, titled Justice with Humanity, received widespread support. At a town hall meeting, Jonathan shared his vision. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about creating a system where fairness and respect are the norm. We have to move beyond punishment and towards understanding." His words resonated deeply, inspiring many to join the movement. The cafe where the incident occurred also underwent transformation. The management partnered with community groups to host monthly discussions on diversity and inclusion. They displayed a plaque at the entrance reading, "A place for everyone, built on respect and unity." The most touching moment came during a public reconciliation event. Grant approached Jonathan in front of a crowd. His voice trembled as he said, "I'm sorry for how I treated you and others. I hope to be a part of the change you're leading." Jonathan shook his hand, replying, "It's about actions moving forward. Let's build that change together." This moment marked a shift not just for Grant, but for the entire city. It showed that even those who have caused harm can choose to learn and grow. Jonathan's approach earned him national recognition. He was invited to speak at universities, law enforcement academies, and civil rights conferences. His message was consistent. We must demand accountability, but also extend the possibility of redemption. Change is a collective effort. Families who had felt powerless in the face of discrimination shared their gratitude. "Your actions gave us hope," one mother said. "You showed us that we can stand up and make a difference." The incident that began with bias ended with growth. The city implemented mandatory bias training for all public officials, creating a precedent for other towns. People began to see each other not as adversaries but as allies in building a fairer society. Jonathan's story became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that standing up for justice could spark change far beyond the moment. It proved that with resilience and compassion, even the most painful experiences could lead to progress. Jonathan's encounter with Officer Grant became more than just a personal moment of resistance. It became a symbol of how strength, integrity, and the refusal to accept injustice can change not only minds, but also entire systems. Reflecting on the incident, Jonathan shared, "This was not about me as an individual, but about everyone who faces prejudice daily. If my actions can inspire even one person to stand up or one system to change, then it was all worth it." The city, once divided, began to show signs of unity. Conversations that were previously avoided became necessary and commonplace. People started questioning their biases and challenging discrimination where they saw it. Community leaders, inspired by Jonathan's calm yet firm stand, initiated programs aimed at promoting inclusivity in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. The ripple effects of Jonathan's courage even reached national levels. Other cities took note of his work, adopting similar policies to improve law enforcement practices and community relations. His story was shared in classrooms, offices, and family dinner tables, sparking dialogue about the importance of justice and equality. Jonathan's actions reminded people that change often starts with a single moment of bravery. By staying calm, standing firm, and believing in his own worth, he showed that even the most intimidating challenges can be met with dignity and strength. The cafe that once symbolized exclusion became a hub for community togetherness. Monthly diversity discussions drew large crowds, and its new policies made it a welcoming space for everyone. everyone. A mural depicting a message of unity was painted on one of its walls, a lasting reminder of the transformative power of justice. As for Officer Grant, his journey of redemption was a testament to the fact that even those who make grave mistakes can learn and grow if given the opportunity. His decision to confront his biases and take meaningful action turned him from a symbol of prejudice into a symbol of change. Jonathan's story ended with a hopeful message. When faced with hate or ignorance, don't respond with the same. Stand tall, stay true, and show the world what strength really looks like. Now, the question turns to us. How will we respond when confronted with injustice? Will we have the courage to speak out and create change, no matter how small it seems at the moment? Let us know in the comments how you would handle a similar situation, and if Jonathan's story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of strength, courage, and hope.